Good evening, everyone. We are Group 12 and we will be giving our presentation on the topic Trust Among Strangers in Internet Transactions, an empirical analysis of eBay's reputation system. So let me start with the introduction. Reputations in a classic marketplace spread by word of mouth on a retail basis. The news of a dissatisfied customer at a store or even a dozen of dissatisfied customers is not likely to reach the ears of most potential customers. So there are some coordinated rating agencies in regular markets that rate these marketplaces. So how is trust traditionally created when goods are exchanged? Most retail transactions are conducted locally, which gives individuals the opportunity to inspect them. As say with fruit in a rural market, if quality is not good, no trust is needed. So retail operations tend to a large relative to the local market, be there vegetable sellers or a local department stores. Even when one personal interactions are limited, given that a retailer sales are concentrated in a local market, it is easy to develop a reputation so customers learn about the retailers from their peers. Retailers' reputations are borrowed from other contexts. For example, retailers are likely to be pillars of the church and community and would be highly reluctant to sacrifice the status that comes from such reputations. Reputations are built over many years. At an extreme, witness the reputations of banks of Scotland or any leading marketplaces. Reputations are borrowed from others as well. Thus, celebrities will attest to the quality of products. New goods benefit from established brand names and policing of quality. A significant expenditure, example, building a fancy store on downtown Toronto, or that indicates one will be reliable, lest the expenditure be wasted. The eBay's reputation system is applied to buyers as well. However, buyers' reputations matter substantially less since sellers can hold goods until they are paid. The greatest risk is that they will not get paid, in which case they can turn to the second high bidder. Moreover, even if seller wish to rely on buyers' reputation, it would be little good since it is not possible to exclude buyers with bad reputations from one's auction. eBay's feedback system. Let's see how eBay's reputation system actually works. So before participating in any auction as either buyer or seller, people register providing information to eBay, including names or and contact information. The only information that eBay verifies, at least for buyers, is that the email address is valid or not. Not all the information provided to eBay is visible to other users. In particular, as part of the registration process, the user chooses an online pseudonym or an ID. Feedback summary statistic is the number of unique users who left positive feedback minus the number of unique users who left negative feedback. If the buyers choose to click on the summary feedback score, they see details of the seller's feedback profile. This includes a breakdown of positives, neutrals, and negatives, and also breakdown of most recent week, month, or a 6 month period. The buyers can then scroll down to view the text of the actual comments, which are most recent comments, and it is possible to scroll through any or all of the comments. A user can change the pseudonym presented to others at any time, but the previous feedback follows the users. It is possible, however, to get a new email address and register completely new, thus leaving behind one's previous feedbacks over time. Let's discuss about the datasets used by the authors in this paper. The primary data source consists of transactional data from eBay from February 1st to June 30, 1999, and all feedback data up to June 30, 1999. This dataset contained more than 20 gigabytes or the equivalent of more than 13 million pages of double-spaced text. In order to protect the privacy of the users, the dataset does not include email addresses, pseudonyms, or any other personally identifying information. In order to protect eBay's commercial interests, authors were also not able to report the data that could be used to infer revenue or profits, such as average number of items sold or average selling price. Several smaller data extractions from the basis of the analysis were also taken in this paper. The first was the listed items of datasets. It is a sample of single items that were open for public bidding. 36,000 of these items attracted a bid at least as high as both the starting bid and the reserve price and hence were officially sold, which were listed on February 20, 1999. The second data extraction was the longitudinal listings dataset, which contains all the items listed by a sample of 1,000 sellers. During the full-time period of February 1st to June 30, 1999, the dataset contains around 168,000 item sales. It is too large to permit detailed analysis, but it is useful for assessing the extent of repeated interactions between particular buyers and sellers. And the last data extraction focuses on negative feedback in particular, and it consists of a random sample of 15,000 negative feedbacks entered on May 1st, 1999. For each recipient of this negative feedback, all transactions from February 1st to June 30 were also extracted. Now my teammate Vineet will be discussing the rest of the paper.
Hello everyone, my name is Vinith. I'm going to start with the general characteristics of the eBay marketplace. In this paper, they examine three characteristics of the eBay marketplace. Coming to the first one, are most transactions really between strangers or do users develop ongoing trading relationships? For this, they assess the frequency of ongoing trading relationship and examine the trading histories of 1,000 sellers in the LL dataset. Overall, the sellers sold 168,680 items during the 5-month period starting from February 1 to June 30th and at an average of 169 items each. And there were 121,564 distinct buyers. There were 138,458 distinct seller-buyer combination. This indicates that 17.9% of all sales involved a buyer and a seller who had done business with each other before. In the vast majority of cases, multiple transactions between a seller and buyer occurred within a few days of each other. In most cases, even these multiple transactions are best thought of a single interaction. Thus, performance in the current transaction will rarely be directly remembered by future buyers who are after all different from the current buyer. An excellent reputation is needed to make current performance visible to other buyers. Coming to the second characteristics, what is the distribution of prior feedback for buyers and sellers? Sellers tend to be far more experienced on average than the buyers. The sellers are much more likely to have a very high feedback scores, and the seller's median was 38 and the buyer's median was 8. So eBay must be attracting professional sellers who are deliberately acquiring items from other sources in order to sell them on eBay. On the other hand, about a quarter of items were listed by people with net scores of less than 20 and 18% were listed by sellers with scores of 10 or less. Thus, this is a very large contingent of amateur sellers. And coming to the third characteristics, do most buyers also tend to sell or the buying and selling roles distinct? While some eBay users are traders, most are primarily either sellers or buyers. They have traced the selling and buying of all users who listed or bought items in the LI extraction for the entire period starting from February 1 to June 30th, 1999. For the sellers in the LI extraction, the median number of items sold during the 5-month period was 76, but the median number of items bought was just 9. And for the buyers, the median number of items sold was 0 and the median number of items bought was 28. Next topic is about provision of feedback at eBay. The first and most basic question about feedback concerns the extent to which it is provided and its content when provided. Clearly, there are some users with hundreds or even thousands of feedback points, so feedback is given at least some of the time. Here in the given figure, we can see the histograms of feedback profile for distinct buyers and sellers in the LI data set. Each bar shows the number of buyers and sellers respectively, defining the range of feedback scores grouped in that bar. The sellers group includes all users who listed items whether or not the items sold. A brief version of the ratings on eBay or Yahoo suggests that negative feedback is rare. Using computerized matching, they were able to find for each transaction the first feedback from the buyer about the seller that occurred in the 6 weeks following the transaction. Buyers commented on sellers for 52.1% of the items, sellers on buyers 60.6% of the time. Thus, sellers, many of whom have quite extensive experience, will have at least some expectations that there will be the feedback on their transactions. Sellers for slightly less expensive happy. The most common complaint by sellers is that the winning bidder is simply doesn't follow through on the transaction. A cursory examination of the follow-up comments after negative feedback suggests that even this transaction sometimes end with happy buyers. Analysis of the test comments accompanying the 111 negative and 62 neutral comments revealed many reasons for dissatisfaction. Surprisingly, items that did not match the description were somewhat more likely to receive neutral than negative feedback, perhaps reflecting that the buyers may have thought that they were honest mistakes on the part of sellers. Similarly, slow shipment was more likely to lead to a neutral feedback than a negative feedback. Not following through on a sale, or worse, not sending the item after receiving the payment, tend to yield negative feedback rather than the neutral feedback. Next slide is about does prior feedback predict future performance. As suggested in the introduction, the feedback system may be useful even if it is not predictive of future performance as long as people believe it is. There are also game theoretic models in which buyers should punish sellers for prior negative feedback or punish newcomers for lack of prior positive feedback, even if prior feedback does not indicate future performance. Still, it is interesting to investigate whether prior feedback is predictive. Negative feedback appears to be less frequently directed to experienced sellers than to those who are less experienced. The feedback profile of buyers follow a similar pattern, although they have somewhat less problematic feedback overall than sellers. One possible explanation is that those who are buyers in the transactions in the sample had much more of their prior feedback from purchases than did our sellers. Since buyers offer a good standard money and offer it first, one might expect buyers to receive less negative feedback overall than sellers. We next turn to the question of whether prior feedback could be used to help buyer avoid problematic transactions. Again, by using the LR data extraction, the overall probability of a neutral or negative feedback was 0.46%. This may be an underestimate of the 2% of problematic transactions because problems may be resolved before users contribute feedback, and even if the problem is not resolved, some buyers may not leave negative feedback. It could be a substantial underestimate if participants are restrained to give negative feedback for a fear of retaliation. The feedback the buyer provides about the transaction as a function of the seller's previous feedback profile. It is not obvious exactly what features of the feedback profile should be most diagnostics of the performance. The analysis above suggests that more experienced sellers are better up to a point. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Manoj and I'll continue with the presentation. Incentive effects. Do sellers really pay attention to the feedback profiles? A necessary condition for feedback to have an incentive effect is to encourage better behavior from sellers. It is for them to take care of their feedback profiles. We hear that sellers do indeed care, subtly or not so subtly, encouraging buyers to provide feedback at the end of a successful transactions. And they are going to great lengths to make buyers happy in order to avoid negative feedback. If sellers were concerned about how negative feedback would affect their reputations, we might expect them to provide explanations in response to a negative feedback. This table talks about the unproblematic and the problematic transactions. And as we can see from the third column, it gives the cutoff. If the model predicts a probability less than this cutoff, then the transaction would be accepted. Since some of the accepted transactions have predicted probabilities far less than the cutoff, the figures in the right column tend to have somewhat lower values. Equilibrium considerations. High courtesy equilibrium. There are two surprising facts about the feedback game on eBay. The first one is the high rate of providing evaluations, and the second one is the extreme rarity of neutral or negative evaluations. The first suggests that free riding is overcome. The second one, that the buyers are grading generously or saying nothing after any bad experience. We think of this as a high courtesy equilibrium. Manners frequently lead people to make small cost efforts even when dealing with strangers that one will never again encounter. This promotes general welfare and a sense of community. The frequency of positive feedback can also be a result of high courtesy. eBay does not provide a facility for searching for a seller's negative feedback comments, leaving potential buyers with the task of scrolling through all the other feedbacks to find the rare but informative complaints. Finally, eBay encourages buyers to contact sellers to try to resolve their problems and leave negative feedback only as a last resort. As we can see from the table, there are two striking features about this table. The first one is there is a noticeable correlation in the propensity to provide feedback at all. The second one is there is a very strong correlation of buyer and seller feedback when both of them provide the feedbacks. The seller is positive 99.8% of the time when the buyer is positive, but only 39.3% of the time when the buyer is neutral or negative. Similarly, the buyer is positive 99% of the time when the seller is negative, but only 23.9% of the time when the seller is either neutral or negative. This overwhelming correlation is presumably due to two factors. The first one is some transactions just work out poorly. For example, a shipment that gets delayed and elicits complaints, and both parties get upset. Second one is even when one side of the transaction has been without a blame, there is a retaliation. Paying initiation dues. Many organizations have initiation dues to be paid before one can be a member, and this may well be the case on eBay, even though eBay does not charge any entry fee. For example, a new seller might find it difficult to make a sale or may get a significantly lower price until his reputation is built. That is, buyers may consider the extent of a seller's record before deciding whether to do business with him and the price that should be offered to him. If this is so, it may be a worthwhile for goods to enter the market and pay the initiation dues. Initiation dues in effect are a way of creating trust. Such dues are to sales on the internet the equivalent of what a massive advertising campaign is for a new retail brand. Conclusion. The Internet, despite its vast scale and intense use, it seems likely that many aspects of reputation systems for the web have yet to develop. Despite the lack of incentives to provide feedback, especially negative ones, the system appeared to work reasonably well. We considered two explanations for this. The first one is the system might still work even if it is unreliable or unsound, if its participants think it is working. So, if sellers believe poor behavior will elicit negative feedback and the buyers depend strongly on reputations, then sellers will behave well and bad sellers will be deterred. The second logical explanation is even though the system may not work well in the statistical sense, it may function successfully if it swiftly turns against undesirable sellers, a process we call stoning, and if it imposes costs for a seller to get established, what we label initiation dues. It is interesting to speculate about whether eBay would be better off with a system where mildly dissatisfied buyers record their satisfaction levels more than they do now. It would help buyers to differentiate among sellers perhaps creating greater faith in the effectiveness of the feedback system. On the other hand, making dissatisfaction more visible might destroy people's overall faith in eBay as a general safe marketplace. Thank you.